Welcome to NAPChat, our regular National Advisory Panel podcast where we chat about homelessness and multiple disadvantage, including trauma, mental illness, domestic abuse and addiction. We recognise that we've all been on our own unique journeys and none of us have a monopoly on the truth, just our own. This podcast carries a warning. We may discuss things that are distressful or triggering and you should listen to it at your own discretion.
So if you don't give a child what they need to develop, their brain will develop differently than if someone's getting all the love and nurturing. And if you were to scan the two brains, you could actually see the difference. So there's that kind of trauma. And then there's trauma, you could be 30, get raped, get attacked. So there's all different types of trauma. From my experience on the street and volunteering with rough sleepers, I've not met anyone that hasn't suffered from trauma. So, I would say a lot of people have experienced trauma, and there's different types of it and different levels.
The thing is, I think what people need to try to come to grips with is the processes that get you into a position of being homeless and what you have to go through while you are homeless and dealing with the system, to use a generic term. That is continually traumatic. There was no peace, no quiet. The things that the average household can take for granted, that things like letters are in one neat place. If you're living in a sleeping bag, you've got no filing system. You don't have the luxury of trying to sort things out, but the system will expect you to be there and ready with answers. And just looking at something that's very relevant today, the cost of living crisis is going to, unfortunately, push people into homelessness. And you imagine yourself in a position where you've run things, you've looked after your family, and things are just breaking down because you just cannot make those numbers add up. And then you get evicted, or things get even worse and you find yourself on the street. You haven't just got the problems of what you've just been through. You're going to be looking at yourself and saying, how could I have failed my family? What did I do wrong? Could I have done better? Just imagine all those things streaming through your head and then suddenly finding yourself in what is effectively an alien world. It's the same country, but you're in a very different position. So all these people are getting some form of trauma, and they need compassion from those around to realise just how difficult it is and how, they're falling into an abyss and they need help out of it.
Well, the most traumatic thing for somebody on the street is to deal with officialdom. The last time I was on the street, I went back to the day centre that's helped me the other two times, and a guy actually accused me of doing something to cause my homelessness. And I told him he lied. I told him he was wrong. Most people just accept it. That's not me. I don't accept things.
Yeah, I think part of the problem when we talk about trauma is we talk about those specific instances. Like, I was sexually abused as a child and groomed and whatnot, but that's not how my trauma presents in reality in the day-to-day. So, and again, with homelessness, it's, yes, being homeless was fairly traumatic a lot of the time, but it affects me day-to-day now, where if I get wet feet, I panic that I'm going to end up and not be able to put my shoes on because they're that bad. And that relates back to the trauma I experienced. And I think services often struggle with how to deal with those sort of instances and experiences of trauma and how to accommodate that in the day-to-day. But when you think, I'm one person and I have a lot of triggers, that's so difficult for a staff member to try and remember, doesn't cope well with seeing a pack of wine gums. She doesn't cope well with this particular smell, or that's exhausting. I can tell you that. But for a staff member who's potentially dealing with 30 clients, I mean, how exhausting for them. And yet, we'll call them a trauma-informed environment. And that's I think what frustrates me. And yes, there are obviously wider things that you can do in actually the preference might be a letter rather than a phone call and whatnot. But I think it's a really, really difficult subject for people to get their head around.
Just trying to build on point. One of the things that the services, whether it's the big national things like DWP, NHS, or the local charity trying to help people, where possible, try to get to know and understand your client. And point immediately picks up on the problem that you've often got one person trying to deal with many, and that person may be on different shifts. So it's not a simple thing to suggest this, but the more you understand who you're dealing with and what they're going through, you can put in place things like, for example, this person has serious nightmares. They're always going to be in a very bad place in the morning, so try to call them in the afternoon. Try to make meetings in the afternoon, because that way both sides are more likely to be able to communicate with each other. And think about what you're saying about people. Somebody who has very serious anxiety issues, which manifest at times as full-blown agoraphobia, just cannot get out. To be told that you failed to attend something when you've actually got dressed and ready to go out and you've spent hours just standing and you can't leave your home, or you get outside and you can't get on the bus. That sort of thing of not putting additional pressure on people by saying you failed to do this and so on is, I think, very important. We've also got issues around some of the sanctioning that takes place with the DWP and Universal Credit and PIP. Okay, there are times that people are trying to mess with the system, and that is a very different thing to the majority who are trying to work with the system but have problems. And because they failed, in inverted commas, to do something at a certain predetermined time, actually hitting them with a massive sanction is only making their situation even worse, making their problems that much more difficult. And sometimes just taking a simple thing and saying, right, things are going in the wrong direction, we need to put them right, we need to have a meeting or do something on the phone, just to try and carry that person through their difficulty and make sure the outcome is a positive one.
So part of the job, the work we do, we do sit down with people at the end of the experience of being homeless. Once they're housed, and we talk to them about the experience. And it is remarkable how many people talk about the experience of approaching services and getting support was the worst thing about that experience. One guy I've known a long time, he was saying the more staff there are on the project, the worse it is. And he was someone who'd been around all the all the kind of local services. So I think that's something which I guess that I don't know how that can land with people who assume that services are a force for good. But I think that is something which not alone in saying exactly that. I think actually it's a very common theme, and I think there's also as kind of saying about different kinds of trauma. I think there can be a really simplistic idea of trauma. So you tell a member of the public about trauma, they think about they might think about childhood sexual abuse, or they might think about a veteran who'd served in combat or a car crash or something like that, which are all absolutely true. But there's a whole kind of interaction between traumatic experiences and kind of supportive experiences. Saying if a child doesn't get that kind of love and support in those early stages, that can in itself erode people's ability to then be resilient later on. And I think so. There's this whole kind of real complicated matrix of kind of risk factors and protective factors, and I don't think people understand it, because I've worked with a lot of people who they might be seen to be coming from a nice family. That doesn't necessarily mean that they haven't had in very specific and unique experiences that had a big impact on them. So I think that's something which I don't think the sector really has taken into account. You talk about trauma-informed practice. I've heard services talk about, we got some decorators in that made the walls look nice, and that makes it a trauma-informed service. And it's not even scratching the surface.
When systems themselves are traumatising, so often people who have been through either childhood trauma or traumatic events will have PTSD, and part of PTSD you have memory suppression, where when you're being asked questions about certain circumstances that have happened previously that may have potentially have caused that trauma, they may be one of the first times that you're actually processing that information, and to be doing that whilst you're in a meeting with somebody where they have a particular outcome can be completely re-traumatizing and cause so many issues. So staff really need to be trained to know how to deal with that and cope with that themselves, because I mean that can be quite distressing to see somebody in that state, you know. I've been in a situation myself where there are things where I may have not thought about this certain thing that has happened, completely forgotten about it, and by being asked those questions, it brings up a whole, and I've just been blubbing like to this woman who I don't even know.
It kind of just kind of relates to quite a few people have said, but that the way it's inbuilt into services to basically blame people for certain things. So, you know, within homelessness law, you've got intentional homelessness, which again, you know, first of all, very few people are actually intentionally homeless, but the impact of telling a mum that she's intentionally homeless, that she's chosen to be homeless and all that kind of stuff, like I think, you know, I don't know, professionals, like they've come a long way. Like if you look even like 10 years ago, you know, the kind of the language and what's acceptable now is certainly a lot better than what was acceptable to say 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So the idea of trauma informed stuff is led to improvements, but obviously there's a long way to go, and there's a lot of kind of, you know, tick boxing stuff. But I don't think people realise, you know, you get that intentional homelessness letter and you don't know what you're going to do with your kids and stuff, and actually that's in itself that makes it even harder now to kind of move forward. And that's not something that I don't think a lot of professionals care. They kind of see it as a moralistic kind of issue, and they don't really understand, you know, what, you know, human psychology is really doing behind the scenes. So it's it's horrible for a lot of people, like a lot more people than you realise.
It's difficult, I think, when it comes to sort of the way that staff speak to clients. A lot of it is around their intention and the place that the client's in. I remember going to sort of a hostel type accommodation and talking about mental health, and she asked, like, you know, what sort of triggers do you have? And I told her sort of the main few, and she made a joke about, oh, you've got a lot. Now, optimistically, in the place I'm in now, I can see that she was probably just trying to build rapport. But at that current moment, when I didn't know her and I'd already been let down by multiple services and I'd been passed from pillar to post, you know, I didn't see that. I didn't see it in that positive light. I saw it in a way of, well, how am I supposed to trust you now? And I think one of the ways I got over that was after living there for however many weeks, months, can't even remember now, it was becoming more involved, and the staff sort of, you know, involving the people that lived there and using our experiences to improve the place. And then I went, she was actually probably trying to build rapport. It missed the mark because other services had, you know, let me down and not treated me very well. But I think it is to do with people's intentions, and I think staff have got to try and remember that when they're seeing a client for the first time, yes, it's their first time of seeing the client, but the client's seen 12 of you. You're no one different. So yeah.
So I was recently talking to a lady who I know who's currently in a refuge with her children, and I was talking to her about what it's like being in that refuge, you know, and she was saying how awful it is because obviously they had to leave everything behind, their home, their lives, their family, and sort of flee to refuge. And she was saying how alike living in a refuge is. She was comparing it to being back in that relationship. You feel controlled, you feel watched, you feel like you can't parent your children the way in which you want to. You've got cameras watching you. You live in a gated community. You can't order a takeaway. You can't get a taxi to the refuge. And from the services side of it, you understand the reasons why and why they're put in place for those people's safety. But I don't, you know, what she was saying is that the workers don't understand. They don't understand why it's comparable to being back in that place and why that's so re-traumatizing for the women in refuges. And just being able to understand that and making small adjustments can make such a huge difference. And even just offering them the chance to talk that through and how they're feeling is such a small thing, and can really benefit women in that situation. So.
Yeah, I think a very important word in this is the word trust, because for a lot of people, their trust in the system, the people that come to meet them, is completely broken. It doesn't take long to break trust. It takes a long time to build it. It's a very fragile thing, but it's very, very important, especially for people who are going through the situations we're talking about. The person on the receiving end of something that goes wrong is not always able to distinguish between a genuine person trying to help them who's been let down by the system failing to do what it says it would do. And that is an additional problem, because if you, the client, can't distinguish, and that's often going to be the case, then your sense of trust and the sense of people failing you can be even higher. So I think we need to be, this is where we need to try, when we're reaching out to help people, to be as understanding and compassionate as we possibly can be, because unless you've been through a similar situation, it is, I wouldn't say impossible, but very difficult sometimes to appreciate what the homeless person, or the person who is near homeless, who may be on the way to becoming homeless, or just trying to build their lives out of homelessness, just how damaged their trust is in the people and the system. So I would urge people, as part of trauma-informed thinking, is to realise that is often completely shattered. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this Snapchat. Like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode and keep up to date.